Sir Bob Kerslake. Bob's head of the Home Civil Service and he's permanent secretary of the Department of Communities and Local Government. So he followed Gus O'Donnell, the former holder of that role, the Cabinet Secretary. Sir Bob continues to be permanent secretary of the Department for Communities and Local Government. So I'm pleased to say that Bob graduated with a first-class degree in mathematics from the University of Warwick, so first mathematician to speak up. He later qualified as a member of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy and went on to hold a number of posts with councils in London before becoming Chief Executive of the London Borough of Hounslow. He then moved to Sheffield to take up the post of Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council in '97. From 2008 to 2010, he was Chief Executive of the Homes and Communities Agency, and in September 2010, Sir Bob was appointed Permanent Secretary of the Department for Communities and Local Government. So, Bob, over to you.
Oh, excuse me. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I'm conscious I've come at the end of what's been obviously a long and very interesting day. It's just worth saying in terms of my degree, it wasn't just mathematics, it was very pure mathematics. And I remember on one particular course, which I think was topology, somebody asked the lecturer whether the course had any practical application. And he said, well, if there was one, he hadn't found it yet. Nevertheless, it was a brilliant course, and much of what he taught me, by the way, has stayed with me. In many ways, it's the disciplines and the ways of thinking that were as important as the actual subject matter itself. So, a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, and particularly to talk to such a wide range of people in the sector. And what I wanted to say to you is we absolutely need the sort of collaboration that you're demonstrating today. Because it seems to me that unless we get people coming together, government departments, academia, NGOs, the private sector, to discuss science advice in Whitehall, we're not likely to make the sorts of advances on the issues that we need to tackle. And I'll come on to that in the future. Let me start by saying that I am very, very clear that the building blocks of our policy making should be robust evidence. I know that's the view of Mark Walport. It is absolutely my view, and I know the view of the Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Hayward, as well. And just to demonstrate that's not just a view without anything behind it, we have a clear example of that in the What Works network, which we launched last month. Two established institutions, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence and the Education Endowment Foundation, will be joined by 4 other institutions focusing on different areas of social policy. The institutions will be responsible for gathering, assessing and sharing the most robust evidence to inform policy and service delivery. And for us, this is a very fundamental and significant shift forward. But I wouldn't want to say that it's the first innovation that's gone on in this area. In fact, it's fair to say that science has a very illustrious history in government. And the first Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Solly Zuckerman, is recognised today as a pioneer of bringing science into government policy. Scientific evidence is what you are experts in providing. Your analysis and advice helps us ensure that our policies are grounded in knowledge. Basing decisions on expert advice plays an important part in the quality of those decisions, but it's also crucial in establishing public trust in decision makers. And we know from our studies of this that there's a widening gap between, if you like, the governing and the governed. A recent poll by Murray, is worth saying, found that doctors were the most trusted profession at 89%, and civil servants came in at a respectable 53%. I won't quote the figure for politicians this afternoon. But if we bring those two things together, I'm absolutely delighted that we have a former medic in Sir Mark Walport taking over as GCSA, because it feels like we're going to get our averages up very rapidly. As we welcome Sir Mark, the importance of the whole scientific community is clear. So what are the challenges for me, for Mark, and indeed for each one of you, is to be an ambassador for the importance of policy-based work, drawing on the best science. And what I would like is for all of you to be confident in your interactions with policymakers and to leave no doubt that your skills and your knowledge should be seen as fundamental to the success of the civil service. If you look at most recent issues, and it only takes a cursory look, you can see that some of the most important government announcements recently have involved very close involvement of the scientific community. From the 8 great technologies of the future to the response to ash dieback, science has had a fundamental role to play. But all of this happens in a very changing landscape of public services. So I thought it'd be helpful to identify what I see as the 5 key challenges that are going to influence our work in the civil service for the medium to long term. The first one I've no doubt has come up already, the challenge of growth and competitiveness. How we stimulate an economy that at the current time is still flatlining and which is key to the prosperity of the country. What we know is that this is a challenge not just for us, but indeed for the whole of the European community. We have a big challenge to get growth rates back to those that existed pre the credit crunch. And to do that requires a complete restructuring of the economy. We need a different form of economy to achieve that kind of sustainable growth model. So growth is, if you like, an obsession of government. Every department sees itself as a growth department. Government, through the cabinet, regularly reviews how well we're doing on this. The second challenge, again, needs very little introduction, the fiscal challenge. It's clear to me that we will face a decade of austerity, not one government. And the ability to understand how we can get better outcomes with less funding is crucial to the success of the public sector in the future. The third challenge is demographic. We know that people are living longer, which is a good thing. But the key question is, how do we make sure that health expectancy matches life expectancy? If we're not to see, for a number of people, a long period of ill health in their lives. So a key agenda for us is not simply the question of an ageing population, but how we change lifestyles in order to ensure that people will lead full and active lives for as long as possible. In other words, we need to live long and die fast. I just wondered whether you get that one quickly enough. Right. The economic challenge, the fourth challenge I wish to raise is the environmental challenge. And it's important to say that that challenge hasn't gone away because we've faced an economic downturn. It remains a crucial and vital challenge for this country and the world. Climate change, pollution, waste management, and a whole host of other issues, and indeed new and emerging issues, must remain within our focus. And then finally, in my 5 key issues, the challenge of trust. How do we get people to believe and understand what we're seeking to deliver through our public service reform? And for me, this is crucial not just in terms of getting support for the changes, but because many of the outcomes we seek to achieve cannot be delivered simply by government services. They need the engagement and the changes in public behaviour, and you can only achieve that if the public trusts the issues that you're bringing to them. For me, these key 5 challenges are going to shape quite profoundly the future civil service. And this morning I spent 2.5 hours in front of the Public Administration Select Committee talking about the future of the civil service. And I wanted to share with you this afternoon my vision for the civil service and for the reform agenda that we're now trying to take through. And in particular, say why I think the connection between what we're doing and the scientific community is so crucial. Now, the reform plan's got 18 separate actions in it. I don't propose this afternoon to go through all 18, otherwise everyone will be asleep as opposed to a small percentage at the moment. And I want to focus on 4 key themes. The first of them, actually, you've touched on in the small bit of the day I've sat in on, an open civil service. I'm passionately committed to the civil service being open in the way it works in every aspect, whether it's open data or open policy making. And you'll have picked up, I think, if you've been following the journey of civil service reform, the work around contestable policy, Whitehall doesn't know best all the time, and we should be open to inviting individuals and organisations from outside the civil service to develop policy on our behalf. And I do feel that science can teach us quite a lot about an open approach, because much of what you do is routinely subject to rigorous scrutiny, whether it's through policy review or other mechanisms. And so for me, in many ways, the potential you can contribute to our work is to have the discipline of open policy making informed by the ways in which you approach your agenda. And I think the interactions between the government, academia and private and voluntary community sectors demonstrates the value that we get in terms of the quality of our policy making from that wide engagement in the work we do. I mentioned earlier the What Works network. What we're seeking to do through that is to garner and capture across the sectors that we're working on the best independent advice. But for me, openness isn't just about policy making. It is about us actively, as policymakers, getting out there and engaging with the academic, private and voluntary sectors. In other words, it's a change of culture in the way in which the civil service works. And our default should be to collaborate and engage from the off in terms of developing policy. So I'm very supportive of secondments to the private sector and to the third sector, and from the private sector and from the third sector, because I think that approach is a vital part of developing our knowledge and skills. So we're very up for secondments out, and we're also very up for secondments in. And I think this is again an area where the Science Committee is doing a good job. For example, the Centre for Science and Policy, our host today, have been extremely innovative through the Policy Fellowship Scheme, which provides opportunities for decision makers from government to forge useful and lasting connections with researchers. I also welcome the work of the research councils, many of whom fund placements for their researchers to come into government and learn about the policy environment. And in my view, this cadre can build the knowledge and skills of the public sector now to be our CSAs of the future. Let me move on to the second theme, a unified civil service. Historically, the civil service is developed as a federal model, individual standalone departments. And it's increasingly clear to us in the reform of the civil service that we need to move to a more unified model of the civil service, working better across boundaries, recognising that the issues that we need to tackle don't fit neatly into particular departments or particular services. I think on this aspect, in many ways, academia suffers from the same challenge, that people grow up and develop in individual subjects, and you also need a more cross-disciplinary approach. And I think it's notable that the former GCSA, Sir John Beddington, set out in his recent review into the science and engineering profession the need to move this further. And one fact I picked up from the review is that 70% of the profession have only worked in one department. We need to develop a culture of a single unified civil service working across boundaries to tackle the issues of the day. It goes well beyond the sharing of services to a culture in which people recognise we organise around the problem and not around institutional boundaries. The third theme is accountability, and again, much coverage of this agenda has been around the relationship between ministers and their officials. But for me, that accountability goes further. It's actually about how civil servants work and how they're held accountable for their performance, and how we strengthen the input of experts into assessing performance. So I think, for example, the involvement of chief scientific advisors with their permanent secretaries and departmental boards is a really powerful model of getting input to the decision making and the review of progress. And finally, skilled civil service. What strikes me when I talk to scientists within the civil service is their passion and in-depth knowledge of their subject. But for me, we have to have a continuous improvement process. We need to have a way in which we develop beyond the specialist skills. And I know that John, in one of the areas that he reported on, said that the professions need to focus on, in a sense, non-scientific areas as well, communications, horizon scanning, and leadership. And much the same point applies to the civil service as a whole. Yesterday we launched something we've called the Capabilities Plan, which is setting out our ambition for growing the skills and capabilities across the whole of the civil service over the next 3 to 5 years. And we identified 4 priority areas for our work: digital, commercial, project and program management, and leadership of change. Now, we don't expect everybody to be experts in these areas, but we do need an appreciation of the power of digital technology to change the way in which we work. So let me conclude. I think the scientific community has a crucial role for the civil service. We will be a smaller civil service, a quarter less than we were at the end of this Parliament than at the start of the Parliament. We need to work openly as a civil service and be a broker of expertise from academia, industry and the voluntary sector. A stronger civil service will not just be able to act on behalf of government, but understand the issues that matter to the public as well. And finally, we need a new public service ethos where we put the user first, we're less bureaucratic, and we break down the barriers between departments in order to address the issues that really matter to people. These are very big ambitions and very big challenges, and I think you have a key part in helping us deliver this change. But let me just finish with one last challenge. I talked earlier of the 5 key challenges that we face and the 5 key drivers. My personal view is that government is very focused and has to be on the issues of the day, but we're nowhere near strong enough in our forward thinking and our horizon scanning. So what are your issues that you think we should be focusing on to shape the civil service in the next 5, 10 and 15 years? Thank you.
So thank you, Bob, for that wonderful overview of the challenges, and quite a challenge given to the audience. So let's see if anyone rises to suggest their answer to Bob's final question. Okay. So any questions or comments? So just one over here, just behind you. Yeah.
Thank you. Glenn Everett from the Office for National Statistics. So Bob, you noted the number 1 driver was growth. And there's several other drivers. But is it growth at any cost? And how do you measure growth, considering the impact it could have on some of the other drivers, such as sustainability and environmental issues?
No, it can't be growth at any cost. And I think I alluded to the fact that one of the challenges for us in creating a growth economy is it can't look and operate in the way in which the economy did when it grew before. I mean, put bluntly, a large part of our growth was debt funded. We have to find ways of delivering growth that links to investment in new technologies, that links to exports, that links to production. So in one sense, it isn't just about more growth, it's about a different kind of economy. And there clearly will be trade-offs that have to be made. And I suppose my message in raising things like the environment is that those trade-offs still stand. They haven't gone away as critical trade-offs. So absolutely, growth is vital because it forms the wealth creation for funding so many things we need to do. But in the end, the purpose of that growth is to create a better country that people live in. And if the consequence of our growth doesn't do that, then we've got to look again at what we're doing.
Okay. So just I'll take a few questions before turning to Bob.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You put the challenge back to us, and I perhaps reflect a challenge back to you.
Right. This is a bit of ping pong, isn't it, really?
Key issues that I had to deal with when I was working in strategy was technological step jumps. Have you looked back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and put yourself in that position and look forward and say what technology would be available today? So few things would have been forecast. Twitter, mobile phones that have such powerful capability, shale gas, there are just a whole host of things which we haven't properly anticipated. So a challenge for the civil service going forward is how to incorporate an understanding of the fleet of foot required to anticipate and deal with technological change.
I think it's entirely fair, and the limitations of obviously any work we do on horizon scanning is that it's not going to produce kind of precise and measurable and accurate forecasts of what will happen. So we have to be, but we have to do more of that, I think, to at least know what the possibilities are. We need to have scanning that allows us to see what the range of things that might happen are, both good and bad. You know, we have to look at, for example, how well we're going to protect the country from infectious diseases through plants and animals. We need to know what the boundaries of these risks are. But there are huge opportunities in technology that we need to understand. I was reflecting recently, probably tells you something about my age, that I actually was in school when the first computer of any sort was available. And it was a pretty clunky and ineffective machine as well. We had to take it in turns to use it you got a chance every month if you were lucky in the sixth form. Just kind of think of the massive change that's happened in my working career, or even in the last 5 years, as you say. And I guess the question then is, given that we can't predict these things, how do we organise ourselves to be adaptable and agile to respond early to the opportunities that come along, I think? And I don't truthfully have the answer to that question. We are setting up a group across Whitehall to look at this issue of horizon scanning. I think one bit of it will be to ask exactly the question you just raised.
So there's a question at the back.
Jenny Dibden, Joint Head of the Government Social Research Service. There's been a lot of talk today about the balance between supply and demand, and on balance, a view that there's more supply of evidence than there is demand for it. Now, as a civil servant, my basic reason for being there is to give good advice, which I think works on the demand side. And government's about the allocation of scarce resources. Therefore, again, that works in our favour. And we've now got civil service reform. Do you think between the basics of being a civil servant, why government exists, and the civil service reform plan, we've done enough to create the conditions to increase demand for evidence?
I think we're making progress, but I don't think we're entirely there yet, if I'm honest. One of the important pieces of work which I just touched on is developing a new approach to open policy making, which is being led by Chris Wormold in education. And they have developed not a kind of absolute blueprint about how you develop policy, but the kind of key principles that should underpin good policy making. And if we can take policymakers through that process so that they can understand that and it's inculcated in the way they do business, I think it will become the default, and therefore the demand will go up through that route. So part of this is about, I think, changing the way in which policy is formed, changing the way on a day-to-day basis policymakers do their work within government. But I would be quite honest with you to say that there are quite a lot of competing pressures here. The pace at which people want answers, the need for ministers to get quick decisions and develop policies, all of these things work against the development of evidence. And therefore I think the best kind of countervailing thing we can do is to have it inbuilt into the, if you like, the disciplines of our policymakers. And that's where we're focusing our attention at the moment.
So, Bob, if I could just ask, make one comment or ask a question concerned with what you said. You mentioned the interactions encouraged, policy fellowships, interactions, secondments into and out of the civil service. I suppose from the time I was a chief scientific advisor, the thing that really hit me very quickly was the point that Jill made earlier about timeliness. Ministers have decisions to make about certain things. There are certain things that are going through Parliament or that are on their desk. And if it's something else, it can be very compelling, but it's unlikely to get acted upon. And that timescale is very, very different from that of the evidence gathering or evidence generation. But it seems to me that there's quite a lot to be won by secondments from the science space and the university academics that have been seconded or have met people from the civil service that are seconded into academia, because as they realise that, as they see that, they can adapt their own interactions with civil servants accordingly. They can ask the civil servant, you know, I'm working on this area, when in the next few years is this likely to come to a head, because there's some regulatory decision to be made or some European directive that has to be responded to or whatever, and thus attempt to get at least some alignment of those, of those things.
No, I think it's a really good point you make, and I actually agree that the biggest, as I said earlier, there are quite a few things that work against good evidence policy making. One of them is the absolute kind of imperative to do things quickly and have answers quickly to problems when they emerge. I mean, Ash Dieback is a good example, actually, with that sort of pressure. And I think you're right to say you can't absolutely avoid that problem, right? But you can reduce the risk of it by having closer and better interaction ahead of the problem arising. That's really your point. Let me just give you a kind of small example from actually a different job I had when I was in Sheffield. And one of the things we were keen to do was to have a better link with the university. And so we went to see the university, and they said, if you want kind of jobbing consultants, we're not the right people to do that. We'll take too long, we'll argue about whether you got the spec right, and we'll almost certainly come up with an inconvenient answer to the problem. So if that's what you want, we're not the people to do it. The best way to use us is to collaborate and share with you what our research work is, and then for you to draw your own insights and conclusions from it. So what we set up was a public sector university club, as we called it, that met every couple of months, and we heard from a public policy maker and from a person in that field about where their research was going. It was incredibly powerful because we developed insights and thinking that were immensely useful when we came to make the decisions. So I think you're absolutely right to say, almost if you've got to the point where you are coming to make the immediate decision, it's too late. You've got to build those relationships well ahead of that point. And secondments are one way of doing it.
So further questions? Let's take a few, and so one there. No, forward from there. Yes, glasses and the beard.
A previous, I'm Ben Martin from Sprue and a fellow at CSaP. A previous CSaP event focused on the role of the special advisor. And sometimes these seem to have certain advantages in terms of getting messages in quickly, and we've heard several times today the importance of being there at the right place at the right time. And think tanks are often more adept at using these than academics. These seem to have grown in numbers and perhaps in influence over time. I wondered if some sort of division of labour has been worked out between the traditional civil service route for influencing policy versus the special advisor. What are the pros and cons as you see it for the two routes, and whether the increasing influence of the former, the special advisor, will continue to grow, or have we now reached a sort of levelling off of that?
Right, so there's another question just on that side.
Thank you. Miles Parker from the Centre for Science and Policy. In 1968, the Fulton Committee commented adversely on the fact that many scientists and engineers and other professional specialists were not given responsibility or authority, and recommended that they be given more policy training and management opportunities. I think Jill Rutter touched on this point earlier on today. In parallel, they were criticising the cult of the amateur or generalist in the civil service. And we really don't seem to have moved very far on. We're still facing the same sort of problems. This suggests that there is some built-in inertia in the system. I'd be interested to know what you think the basis of that inertia is and what we can do to overcome it. Thank you.
Right, and then a final question in this round from the front here.
David Cleveley. Bob, you talked at the end about the skills in the civil service, the digital, the commercial, the project management and leadership. And it strikes me that we're talking about two different kinds of civil service here. We're talking about the civil service as policymakers and the civil service as managers and executors of processes. Do you think this civil service reform is actually the beginning of something which will change the civil service yet again after we've got through this, because it strikes me that it's very difficult to sustain those two modes of operation within a single organisation.
Yes, three pretty tough questions. I'm glad I had a bit of time to think about the first one. I think special advisors play an important role within government in supporting ministers, and I think that role of special advisor isn't going to disappear, or I think it will be sustained in the future, whichever government comes into power in 2015. In terms of your choices of which route you go through, I would say you, in effect, ought to be going through both routes, really. Ministers will take decisions based on advice from officials. They look to officials to give them the kind of in-depth, thorough advice based on evidence that I spoke about earlier. And that's, in a sense, a standing requirement that I don't see going away. I wouldn't want to go away. And typically, that advice is going to be about both the benefits or otherwise of the policy and the challenge of delivering that policy as well. So it's not just one, it's both. So if you want to impact on the options for government, or indeed if you want to introduce ways of tackling well-established challenges, or even highlight the potential challenges we might not have seen ourselves, all of that should and can and should go through the conventional routes into the civil service, the mainstream civil service. My experience of special advisors is that they probably play three roles predominantly, and they're all in the here and now, and they're all pretty tactical. They clearly play a role of communicating and promoting the policies of ministers. They clearly play a role in developing ideas, responses, quick responses to the issues that ministers face at this current time. And thirdly, they play a troubleshooting role for ministers when they hit difficult issues. Now, those are all quite tactical, and therefore I think how you engage with them will be different from the way you might engage in the mainstream civil service. And it may be more about when they hit an immediate issue that's in the news, if you like, now. Clearly, special advisors will come in, be playing a key role in helping the minister, and if it's a fast-moving event, talking to both the mainstream civil servants and the special advisors would be the way forward. But I think both are going to continue, and both going to continue to coexist for some time in the future. I wouldn't agree with you on the second question that we haven't moved on since Fulton. I think there's some good evidence that we have. I can't claim to have been there at the time when he did his report, but let me just highlight a few of those. I think, first of all, in relation to some of the kind of, let's call them the operational specialisms for a moment, things like finance, IT, human resources, there's been, I think, a very substantial change over the last decade, and I observed this as somebody who used to be on a non-executive board. So there has been a move towards a recognition of different skills in the civil service. I think actually in relation to scientific advisors, there's been some advance in their ability to access and play a key role in departments, and particularly the work I know that John did around their role into advising boards, for example, I think was very important. So I don't think it's the case that we haven't made progress, and we have now, I think, a pretty solid number of professions that are very influential in the work of the civil service. My personal view is I'd like to get rid of the word generalist, actually, from the language of how we talk about in the civil service, because actually it gives that notion of the gifted amateur, and we don't have gifted amateurs. The policy-making profession, whilst it may not be a formal profession, in the sense of you can join an organisation and you might get kicked out of it, it is in every other sense, in my view, a profession, and and it's a profession you can learn. It's a set of skills you can learn. So to that extent, all parts of the civil service are about developing skills. We need a range of skills, and we need both the policy-making skills and the specialist skills that we talked about earlier. So I do think there's been progress. I do also think, by the way, there's quite a lot of inertia. I would agree with that. And my challenge in delivering the reform plan is to build on some real successes that Gus O'Donnell made when he was Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, but take that a level further, really, move away entirely from this generalist concept. The third question was about this kind of mix of managers. I think as I heard the question right, and tell me if I have, it's about the sense of, are we talking about a mix of managers and policy advisors, and do the two sit well together? I think it's perfectly possible for them to coexist, and actually I think it's perfectly possible to coexist within the expert areas that we talked about as well. Because what typically happens is people make choices really along their career. Some people will want to and always want to stay in their area of expertise. I have someone I know who's an absolute passionate advocate of the economic model in the Treasury. That's all he ever wants to work on. Fine. But actually, we get the best managers if we draw them from the people who are experts in that field and develop their managerial skills. So from my perspective, yes, we need policy experts. Yes, we need scientific experts. But that isn't, in my view, inimical to them also being damn good managers at the same time.